Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 19th episode of the Mannered Podcast. I'm your co-host, Roger Bodee, joined as always with my other co-host and best friend, Michael Hamilton. Michael, how many bulls would a wounded bull bull if a wounded bull could bull wounded bulls?
I don't know. 3, 8. One of those probably. Those are the main numbers on the card.
I thought it was 7 or 8.
We ignore the 7. That one's well, I guess you're winning if it's 7.
Yeah. So yeah, this week we're just going to talk about the Wounded Bull, right? That's what we're just going to spend 45 minutes discussing the art of Wounded Bull, the power of the card, its adjustable power of the card, its defense value.
How flexible it is. You know, sometimes you can spend 3 resources to attack for 7, and sometimes you can spend 3 resources to attack for 8. It just does so many things.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you can overpitch for it. So let's say you had a yellow pitch and a blue pitch. You could pitch the yellow pitch first with the blue pitch, and you'd still have the 2 floating resources to play around things like Ice React.
Yeah. There's so many things you can do with this card. It really is an art to play the Wounded Bull.
I believe it. I couldn't handle such mastery of the card. That's why I didn't include it in my list. And ultimately, that's what cost me the tournament. Had I played Wounded Bull, I would have gone from 4th to 1st or 3rd. Yeah. I don't know, whichever one of those 2 I finished.
Wounded Bull is quite good against the Guardians, you know, because you 3 for 8 them. You just boom, hit them. It's so efficient.
I believe it. But for real, what we're going to talk about, obviously, is Michael Hamilton's Nationals winning Iyslander deck and the decisions he made when building it, and then why I wasn't a firm believer in it, even though I had a whole extra day to completely register his list card for card, and why I made the changes I did. And yeah, so this will just kind of serve as an Iyslander deep dive and deck tech that everybody's been asking for.
Yeah. So I guess to start it off, I'll go through the list, similar to our other.
Okay, be sure to say how many of each equipment you played. That's important.
Okay, it is important. Otherwise, people won't know if there's 1. Maybe there's 3 Waning Moons. Who knows?
Could be.
So, then the Iyslander deck. For equipment, there's Waning Moon, Alluvian Constellus, Coronet Peak, Crown of Providence, Final Spring Tunic, Ironhide Gauntlet, Metacarpus Nodes, Nullvern Hood, and Storm Striders. I just realized Metacarpus Node is singular. There's only 1 node, not several nodes.
Oh, I always thought it was nodes.
Yeah, it's just node, at least according to FabDB. At red, there's 3 Aether Icebane, 3 Enlightened Strike, 3 Fyendal's Fighting Spirit, 3 Scar for a Scar, 3 Sink Below, and 3 Wounded Bull. At yellow, there's 1 Fyendal's Fighting Spirit. And at blue, there's 3 Aether Hail, 3 Aether Icebane, 3 Amulet of Ice, 3 Blizzard, 3 Brain Freeze, 3 Brothers in Arms, 3 Channel Lake Frigid, 3 Cold Snap, 3 Emeritus Scolding, 2 Energy Potion, 3 Frost Hex, 3 Frosting, 1 Heart of Fyendal, 3 Hypothermia, 3 Ice Bolt, 3 Ice Eternal, 3 Insidious Chill, 3 Polar Blast, and 1 Scour.
Did you ever board in a Scour at any point in time?
Yeah, I played it against Oldheim. It's a blue block 3. I did not play against any Viscerize or any Drum Eyes, though, which are the main matchups it's there for. It's just more utility out of your blue block 3 than a lot of the other options, like blue Icebind or blue Winter's Grasp aren't great.
What about that all you got? You could have played that card.
That's a yellow, but I think that card is solid.
I think I meant this round's on me. I always get those 2 cards mixed up for some reason.
Oh, yeah.
It's like that all you got on me, something like that.
I think if I knew Fi was going to be as much of the field as it was, I would have definitely tested this rounds on me. But by the time Fi was like picking up in popularity, I didn't really have basically any time to test the week leading up to Nationals. So all my testing was like the few weeks before that. So I didn't really get a chance to try this rounds on me because, again, I didn't think it was particularly good against the Rune Blades, and I didn't know if I was going to be anywhere near as popular as it ended up being.
Yeah, I just thought about that card because since we usually talk about it so much on the cast, but against Kodachi Fi in particular, it seems like pretty sweet tech. Yeah,
even against the other version of Fi, I still think it's pretty good. They usually go 3 or 4 attacks wide, and it also helps a lot with hitting those 4 power breakpoints that you can really struggle to hit.
Yeah, those 4 power breakpoints were ultimately why I played the extra 3 defense reactions, the 3 Sink Belows, instead of not 3 Sink Belows, obviously, but the 3 paper scenes that weren't in your list. You had the Brother in Arms, but I just didn't like the fact that it always required the resource.
Yeah, I guess that's the reason I got to Brother in Arms was to hit those 4 power breakpoints more often. And also, I found myself very frequently just floating this tunic resource for several turns. And I'm like, if it's just sitting there for multiple turns, it's not that unlikely to just draw the Brother in Arms with a tunic resource is sitting there and get like pretty good value out of it.
Yeah, that was my thought process for Oasis Respite, and then that card always just wound up being horribly clunky.
Yeah, the problem with Oasis Respite is that it is a red that doesn't block when you don't have the tunic resource or a way to create that extra resource. So you basically are forced to have a resource for it. Whereas Brother in Arms, if you don't have a resource for it, it's still a blue. And it blocks 2, which you
It's
usually
not
don't
0.
do. Yeah, 2 is much better than 0. But you still are a pretty blue hungry deck. Like all your Wounded Bulls, all your Finals Fighting Spirits, your Aether Ice Veins, they all take a blue to pitch. And even just pitching it to Coronet Peak is usually fine.
Yeah, that makes sense. You even attacked with it a couple times, I heard over the weekend.
Those were not his finest moments, but I did attack with it a few times. I think there was twice in one match that I ended up attacking with it just because that was just the way the hands lined up, and my opponent wasn't pressuring me enough that I could spend cards defensively, and that was the only thing I could do with 2 cards, really.
What was the matchup?
Oh gosh, I believe it was one of the Iyslander mirrors, but I'm not positive.
That makes sense. If you would have put a gun to my head and said, what matchup would you have ever attacked with a Blue Brother in Arms with? The mirror makes the most sense.
Yeah. Also, like in the mirror, since you don't want to deal like this really small amount of arcane damage because it just charges their Alluvian, it is better than just passing the turn doing nothing, I felt like. So,
but yeah, we can get into that a little bit here. So obviously the beat 'em up Wounded Bull version of Iyslander is just completely favored into the previous builds of Iyslander that only dealt damage through arcane.
Yeah, I think that's just basically a fact. Playing the attack actions means you just have more ways to present damage without charging their Alluvian. And the attacks, again, they're just so much better on rate. And arcane damage into a deck with AB4 or AB5 and 40 plus blues is not exactly the best recipe to beat them. So these attacks trade more card efficiently than the spells do. And on top of that, they don't charge Alluvian when they're defended. So I think playing these attacks just makes you super favored in the mirror.
Yeah, that was my winning in for the calling top 8, where I got paired into the mirror and I had not as many attacks as you did, but still more attacks than obviously traditional Icelanders did. So cards like Enlightened Strike and Bindall's Fighting Spirit and even Command and Conquer were just fine ways to present damage and threats without, like you said, charging the Alluvian Constells, which was really important. And in the mirror too, there's even going to be times where you're going to arsenal a red card just because you're just not always going to have it line up where you can just always arsenal a blue. So in those instances, CNC actually is very relevant as well.
Yeah, and even in the spots where they can play their arsenal out in response, CNC, the fact that it costs 2 isn't as big of a downside because you don't waste the resource a lot of time in the mirror because you can use that one floating resource to pay for Arcane Barrier or basically just pay for Arcane Barrier.
Or if your opponent has a Channel Lake Frigid out, you can it's still an attack that you can just play by pitching 1 blue. Whereas if you're playing Wounded Bull or Findell's Fighting Spirits, obviously you can't just get away with that efficiency at that rate.
Yep. Agreed. 100%.
So that never came up for you though? Just any taxing effects for your 3-cost cards? Because I think Channel Lake Frigid timing and utilizing that card is just one of the most important factors for the edge. For the mirror, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think any of my opponents cast the Channel Lake Frigid in the Wizard mirror.
That's crazy.
No, I don't know if that's true, actually. I think there may have been a Channel Lake Frigid in play at some point. I don't remember perfectly, though.
That's fair. There were a lot of turn cycles that you had over the course of the tournament, so it's not fair to expect you to remember every single one of them.
Yeah.
But it's just a card I very much prioritize just because it makes me feel so safe, particularly in the mid and late game, where I just know my opponent's not going to get too out of line with presenting just a lot of damage, just because even a lot of Icelander's other most threatening card, Aether Ice Vein, also costs 3, so it also becomes difficult to cast that card at that point in the mirror. And then cards like Insidious Chill and turning off energy potions or making energy potions wildly less efficient, or their Tunic, just, I don't know, just that sense of having them be your deck, but worse when you have a Channel Lake Frigid in play, I think is really impactful.
Yeah, I think one thing that isn't super intuitive is that Ice Eternal, it basically is one big spell that spends all of your resources. So you would think that Channel Lake Frigid wouldn't be that good against it. But a lot of the time that you play your Ice Eternal, you want to be sacrificing your energy potions and sacrificing your amulets of life in the same turn. And all of those actions cost one resource, and suddenly your Ice Eternal looks really bad under a Channel Lake Frigid too. So I think it is quite good in the mirror.
Absolutely. It was a card that I used to great effect in the 2 mirrors I played in the tournament. But it wasn't just all mirrors for you and I, though. So what other matchups did you play across the weekend?
It's actually a little bit sad that I think I only played against Fi, Oldheim, and Iyslander the entire weekend in Classic Constructed.
You should have joined me in the calling. It was wild over there, man.
Yeah.
I played against 2 Viserai, 2 Rhinar, a Dorinthia, a Briar, 2 Dromai, 2 Bravo, and an Oldheim, I believe.
That's a lot of heroes, a lot of different heroes you played against.
Yeah. The Oldheim was 100% because it was Isaac Crute, and he beat me twice in the tournament, unfortunately for me. But apparently if he was not as good into the Oldheim mirror, I wish he would have hit an Oldheim mirror in round 1 of top 8, because then I might not have faced him. He got to face the Rhinar in the first round of top 8. But I can't complain about how that broke out, because I got to face the Viserai in the first round of top 8.
Yeah, speaking of Viserai, I think that might be the best matchup for this deck.
Yeah, it's just not close.
All of Viserai's damage becomes so inefficient when we get to have Alluvian Constella. So every time we Arcane Barrier his Rune Chance, we just are netting resources, basically.
Yeah, it becomes like a why are you hitting yourself kind of a deal, where it's like he's presenting damage, but the damage turns back onto him.
Yeah.
And then
on top...
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, on top of that, it also lets us just like efficiently use our resources however we want during his turn. Similar to how Oldheims are generally pretty good into Viserai, that they can like crown however they want because they have no rune boots for eating the Rune Chance. We have a bunch of like random blue cards we want to play from Arsenal, and it's very nice to be able to just spend our floating resources to Arcane Barrier the Rune Chance, and then we can, if it turns out that it's not going to be a good turn to Waning Moon, maybe they're ending the turn with 1 or 2 resources floating, then we can just spend our resources to Arcane Barrier more instead of fire the Waning Moon off. So it makes the matchup very good for Iyslander.
Yeah, and we just naturally get the AB2 for Rosetta Thorn because of Storm Striders, where a lot of decks normally can't ever block that damage, where we just kind of get to soak it up for free if we want to.
Our best equipment is also just very good against Rosetta Thorn. So,
and then the final nail in the coffin, I guess, here for the Iyslander v Viserai is the fact that Iyslander is still just pretty naturally good at disrupting her opponents, just with the frostbites, taxing effects, insidious chills, hypothermias, these kinds of effects. And those are all things that Viserai hates having done to him. He has to play Mauvrin Skies every turn in order to give his attacks go again. So if they go Mauvrin Skies and you play Hypothermia, and they're just like, I don't get to swing Rosetta Thorn anyways, even if I wanted to, my turn's just over. Or they play a non-attack action and they go Swarming Gloomveil, and you Hypothermia them, and their turn's just over, and you just feel good about yourself.
Mm-hmm. And then, speaking of frostbites, for all the reasons Stalagmite is very good against Viserai, Iyslander's hero ability is extremely good against Viserai, and we can even time it between the non-attack actions. So, like, against Oldheim, if you attack, maybe you go Mauve, Shrill, have 1 resource floating or something, and they don't Stalagmite you, then, like, you always felt safe to cast your Revel Runebloods, knowing that they couldn't like give you a frostbite between Revel and swinging with Rosetta Thorn. But there's no safe windows against Iyslander. As long as she has a card in her arsenal, you're always vulnerable to that frostbite.
Yeah, that's just one of her inherent powers. It's just so good just to always make your opponents not know when that tax effect is going to come in either. So they kind of have to go through every permutation of how they're playing their hand out to figure out at what point their turn can just end because of that extra frostbite.
Yeah.
But I think something you said at the start of that conversation, or maybe in the middle, but you said Storm Striders was the best piece of equipment. Could you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, so basically when you're playing Iyslander, you're kind of like, you start the game behind and you're playing this like value game where you're just trying to keep up in damage with them. You're trying to disrupt their big turns and also just like present kind of fairly consistent damage back at them with the attack actions and Waning Moon on their turn as the main ways you deal damage. And your goal basically at the end of the game is to not be more than a few points of life behind them, because between your hero power and Storm Striders, you can present a pretty significant amount of instant speed damage. So if they expend their hand trying to kill you or finish you off, you can, between Storm Striders and your hero power again, you can deal around like 10 damage usually to them on the last turn. So
without more, if you're trying to do like Frost Text endgame combo stuff as well too.
Yeah. Definitely more with Frost Text endgame combo stuff. But that thread that you have at the end of the game where if your opponent doesn't hold back blues or hold back resources, that you're just going to kill them from like 8 to 10 life is very powerful. And I think Iyslander would be significantly worse without Storm Striders.
Yeah. If it wasn't for Storm Striders, I actually would have lost my match, or at least drawn my match with Pheno, where time was literally about to be called. And because of Storm Striders and Metacarpus node, I was able to chain together just like 9 points of arcane damage, and he didn't have enough. He had 2 reds left in his hand at the time, and that was just enough I needed to get across the finish line and end the game. And just having that reach that's ever looming at the end of the game is just insanely powerful.
Yeah. And it's crazy that I think Storm Striders aren't as good in Iyslander as they are in Kano, but they're still so good.
Yeah, because, well, I guess the weird thing that comes up with them, though, is there's never a time before the end of the game where I think it's right to pop Storm Striders. And I actually made this mistake against Kroot in my semis match against him, where he was attacking me with an Oakenold, and I had 2 red Aether Ice Veins in my hand. And I was already at around 20 life at the time, and I just knew that because he's just such more aggressive version of Oldheim, I was never going to see those red Aether Ice Veins again. So it was kind of like, use them now or forget that they exist in your deck. And I wound up popping Storm Striders to just deal like, I think I got across like 10 points of arcane damage, or maybe not 10, but like, so it's the 5 plus the 3 plus whatever I had in my arsenal. I think it was an Emeritus Scalding. So that's another 4. So that's 12 presented, and I think he mitigated 4. So I got 8 points of arcane damage across to him in exchange for taking the 9 on the Oakenold. But then at the end of the game, I just couldn't have that reach, and when Iyslander just can't present that damage, he feels wildly different at the end of the game.
Yeah, for sure. Having so much burst at the end of the game is, I feel like, why the deck works. And also, once you kind of use your Storm Strider's burst turn, it kind of turns off your Fighting Spirits and Wounded Bulls and Scars for a while. I guess you were on less copies of those cards, but part of why, in my opinion, the deck works is because you can still be lower than life than your opponent and winning because of your 8 to 10 points of reach that you consistently have at the end of the game.
Yeah, and that creates really weird game states where in the mid game you could be down by like, I think against one of my Reinars, the score was like 16 to 38 or something like that in the mid game, and I still won that game by just like figuring out ways to chain together spells in really efficient ways combined with Insidious Chill, and then just that last turn burst of just Storm Strider's arcane damage out of nowhere. And that came up in our testing too, because I remember when we were testing in one of our games where I was ahead by like 20 life or something like that, and I just stopped the match and I was like, how behind do you feel right now? Because I feel like significantly ahead. And you're like, I don't feel that bad about this match or this game. And then you wound up winning that game.
I believe I said I was slightly behind. And then the next turn you fused Oakenold. And then I was like, I think I'm reasonably behind. And then I barely won the game in the end.
Yeah, but it was still crazy that like you were able to win that game in testing when I was just so significantly ahead at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So what is Iyslander's bad matchup?
That's a good question. I honestly didn't get a test enough into Briar. I thought that matchup might be kind of tough, but thinking about it more and more, I'm not sure that matchup's actually bad, especially getting access to 3 Blizzard, 3 Hypothermia, and having just like a lot of efficient blocking cards too. I think we have enough disruption for the Channel Mount Heroic turns that it'll be hard for Briar to have a crazy Channel Mount Heroic turn. And then on top of that, a lot of Briar's cards don't block super efficiently.
And it's not too hard for Iyslander to just play some Amulets of Ice out and just sit on them until a Channel Mount Heroic comes out, and then you can just fuse anything and strip every card out of your opponent's hand on the follow-up Channel Mount Heroic turn. And you can even do it on your turn to prevent them from being able to have multiple Earth cards on their turn in their pitch zone to keep it around. So Briar is actually like, I don't think it's insanely good for Iyslander overall, but I think it's still definitely Iyslander favored.
Yeah. I also think Fi and Oldheim, I don't think either of those matchups are like great for Iyslander. I wouldn't say that she's behind or like significantly behind in either of them. And I think like a lot of the advantage I had in the tournament was because people didn't know the deck more than because the deck was like a significant favorite into those matchups. But sometimes your cards need to line up reasonably well against theirs, and you can just die to some of their best draws if you don't have the correct cards for those situations.
Yeah. I think there are only two, well, ironically, they're my two deck losses across the tournament that I felt were significantly bad for me. One was Dromai, and I did beat Fino on Dromai, but it was early in the morning. He was sleepy. The sun was in his eyes. His little brother was actually playing the deck. There are probably a million reasons why I actually won that game. But the second time I played Dromai on day 2, my opponent had 2 Thamais on the battlefield at one point in time with an Asvalai and an Uvia, and then there was the third, and then he attacked me with the Dominion. It was just everything that could possibly go wrong for me in that matchup just started going wrong in the mid game, and it felt real bad.
Yeah, three Thamais is a lot of Thamais, and I think that Dromai can definitely be built in a way that'd be pretty favored against, or at least recently favored against Iyslander. Between Thamai, sand covers, and just like a lot of efficient attacks, I don't actually think like the Ashwings and the Dragons are that good against Iyslander because of how easily disruptive they are. But Thamai specifically, Thamai, Chromai, and her defensive tools, I think, can give Iyslander a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And then the other match was Isaac Krutz balls to the wall, punch you as hard as I possibly can in the face Oldheim. That the more I look back on it, the more I'm like, maybe if I just pivoted my strategy, it might not have felt so bad. But in the back of my mind, I still was so used to getting to at least second cycle against Oldheim pretty consistently. But when Oldheim's on, Rouse, Zealous Belting, CNC Pummels, red glacials, it's just too much damage that he can present, or that version of the deck could present, that actually prevented me from getting to second cycle consistently. And I should have just tried to pivot to just more disruptible game plan at that point, because a lot of those cards that I just mentioned are red. And so I feel like if I just started to try to just play more of a tempo game with like just fusing Insidious Chill or fuse effects with Insidious Chill in the mid game to start to strip his hand a little bit more, or just be more aggressive with my channel like Frigids in the early game or mid game, that maybe there's worlds where I win more games against that version of the deck. But at the time, it just felt horrendous, especially CNC Pummel. That like can hugely punish Iyslander in certain spots.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that you can do against that. First, I think like Zealous Belting and Rouse the Ancients are pretty efficient, but they aren't more efficient than like Fyendal's Fighting Spirit or Wounded Bull, because they're just like similar levels of efficiency, and same for Scar for Scar.
They do those things, but then they followed up with the 6-power hammer attack.
Right. And I'm saying like Zealous into Sledge is 3 cards for 11 damage, and Wounded Bull plus a block 3 is 3 cards for 11, right?
If you're behind.
Right. But that's kind of like the premise of the deck is you're playing Iyslander, you're always going to be behind unless the game's already decided. So you kind of can match them in efficiency. And then the turns that they don't have the Zealous, then their Sledge isn't nearly as efficient, because Sledge is usually 2 cards for 6. And then the other thing is you brought up CNC Pummel, which especially off a Tunic counter is the most efficient play probably in the game, is just CNC Tunic Pummel off of blue. It's just like the most powerful 2-card combo, at least, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Having Crown of Providence, so you can play around that when you have a red in your arsenal or a blue that you don't want to play, is, in my opinion, very important in those matchups. And then also, if you are able to give them you can give them a Frostbite in response to them activating their Tunic, depending on what card is in your arsenal as well, which is another way you can kind of hedge around that.
Yeah, that just never lined up
time.
in that way for me. Whenever I was being attacked in that position, there was just 2 cards in his hand. I don't know. But yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of that stuff. And I wasn't on Crown of Providence, so shame on me, I guess. And that also even punished me even harder for playing the 3 extra Fate for Scenes. Not that Brother in Arms would have helped all that much more in that situation, because obviously I can't respond to it. And it just felt like a situation where I felt damned if I do, damned if I don't. Because if they're playing cards like Oaken Old or Red Glacial or using a 0 for 4 on a Zealous Belting into a block 3 on a hammer, you're leaking 4 points of damage, but that's not that fast of a clock. But then when those CNC pummels pop up, you just get hugely punished for trying to play those really effective and efficient defense reactions.
Yeah. And that, I think that really just speaks to how powerful and efficient Oldhim can be. The fact that you can play him so aggressively and so defensively, and he has like pretty good tools for basically whatever role you're trying to fill, is I think why Oldhim is doing so well and has so consistently been doing well. Is we've seen Oldhim do well with these more defensive tanky versions where they're blocking a bunch and swinging winners well most turns. And then we also see Oldhim doing really well with these very aggressive decks as the meta became more defensive, cared less about on hits and more about just like raw numbers. Oldhim can still compete in these kind of games as well.
Yeah. But I guess that just leaves us in a 2-deck format then almost between Iyslander and Oldhim, where neither deck really has any horrendous matchup. Now they're both slightly maybe unfavored into Dromai, but I think that's about it. And I really don't know what heroes are left to really, pose a challenge to these 2 relevant ice heroes. I would say the ice heroes, but there's poor Lexi sitting over there, so she'll have her time, but just not right now.
Poor Lexi. Well, I think there's a couple places to look. So, like you said earlier, I think Dromai, you can build Dromai in a way that's like probably at least reasonably favored into Iyslander, and I think you can also build Dromai in a way that's reasonably favored into some versions of Oldhim, maybe not all versions of Oldhim. But the versions of Oldhim that are reasonable into Iyslander and Dromai are not the versions of Oldhim that are beating up the aggro decks. They're not the ones that have a 70% win rate against Briar. They're not the ones that beat up Fi all the time. So once Oldhim adjusts to attack these other slower decks like Iyslander and Dromai, I don't think Oldhim will kind of bully the aggro decks the way he has. And then one other deck that did really well at US Nationals was Jacob Baugh's Dash deck. And I think that deck just like smashes Oldhim. Like that matchup seemed really bad for Oldhim. And I think if it has a reasonable Iyslander matchup as well, that's another deck that you could kind of bring in to attack these 2 top of the format decks.
Yeah, I was glad you didn't have to face Jacob Baugh in the finals. I didn't know how that would have played out, I guess.
Yeah, I like Jacob a lot, and I hope he always does well at tournaments, but I was also happier to play against Fi than the Dash that I really didn't even know exactly how I should approach that matchup.
Yeah. Have you played Iyslander v Dash at all?
I have played 0 games of that matchup of any version of Dash, so would have been tough. So I guess we've kind of talked about specific matchups, but I was thinking maybe we should talk about some of the card choices we have in the deck. So I guess I read off my list. What did you play in your list? Do you want to go through it?
Yeah, let me pull up. So in my list, in Roger Bodee's third place, it's not 4th place, it's 3rd place Iyslander deck.
Same thing.
It's 1 place higher.
3rd and 4th, the same thing in a single elimination top 8. But go ahead. I'm ready. Tell me your deck.
I had 1 Alluvian Constellus, 1 Coronet Peak, 1 Findle's Spring Tunic, 1 Ironhide Gauntlet, 1 Metacarpus Node, 1 Nullrune Hood, 1 Stormstriders, and 1 Waning Moon. At red, I had 3 Aether Hail, 3 Aether Ice Vein, 3 Command and Conquer, 3 Enlighten Strike, 3 Fate Foreseen, 3 Freezing Point, 3 Findle's Fighting Spirit, and 3 Sink Below. At 2 pitch, I had yellows in my deck. I had 3 Aether Ice Vein. And then at blue, I had 3 Aether Hail, 3 Aether Ice Vein. This says 2 Amulet of Ice, but it should definitely be 3 Amulet of Ice, 3 Blizzard, 3 Brain Freeze, 3 Channel Lake Frigid, 3 Cold Snap, 3 Emeritus Scolding, 2 Energy Potions, 3 Frost X, 3 Frosting, 1 Heart of Findle, 3 Hypothermia, 3 Ice Bolt, 3 Ice Eternal, and 3 Insidious Chill.
So it sounds like the biggest differences between our lists were in the reds.
No, the biggest differences in our list are between our yellows because it's infinity percent between the differences between our yellow
Sure.
cans.
I have one. I have one finals.
Oh, sorry. It's
yellow.
a
It's just, I never
300%. I'm
blended it
playing
in.
3 times the amount of yellows you are.
Yeah. So yellow, Aether, Ice Vein, huh? You think it's good enough?
Yeah, I think we just play the deck differently. Even when I'm playing the beat 'em up version, I mostly use the attacks, obviously to tenderize, as you famously call them now, my opponent and get their life total low. But I also when I'm playing like this more aggressive version, I pretty aggressively set up Amulet of Ice and Insidious Chills because I think Insidious Chill might just fundamentally be a broken card, especially in Iyslander. I think Iyslander makes it the most broken. It's kind of reasonable if you're not playing at instant speed, but the fact that Iyslander can't always has this instant speed looming threat of not only just with blues in our arsenal, but as we were talking about before, with Stormstrider taking out cards from your opponent's hand during like key sequences or key turn cycles, it's messed up.
Yeah.
So I just wanted as much security in making sure that I was getting those ice fuses off. And that's also why you see the 3 freezing point ultimately in my list, where it's mostly a combo card, but it's also a card I was pretty happy to play just as a 5 for 3 ice fuse, just because you can't Arcane Barrier if you don't have any resources, and Insidious Chill and Amulet I say no resources.
Sure. That makes sense. I think one thing I was realizing as I played more and more of my list was that when I played Insidious Chill, because I only had the 3 red Aether Ice Veins that I really wanted to cast, and then I had some fine like blue fusion cards like blue Aether Ice Vein and Brain Freeze and Ice Eternal, but none of those were cards that I was like, I really want to cast these. So I was noticing that when I was playing Insidious Chill, it would be pretty hard to get 3 counters of value out of it a lot of the time. So I very rarely cast them unless I didn't really have anything better to do.
So. Yeah. Or I was like, I wish this thing had like 18 counters. I was just fusing left and right and win my deck.
And that's just 3 more Aether Ice Veins that made the difference, huh?
Yeah. Yellow Aether Ice Vein. Ultimately, if you're playing him with Insidious Chill, there's not a big difference between 4 and 5 because it's just going to be mostly unblockable damage anyways at that rate. So any turn cycles where you're just stealing turn cycles at that point in the middle of the game, and it makes it easier for you to finish off your opponent, because if you could have any blue ice card that you're fusing Aether Ice Vein with. If after you've stripped your opponent's cards out of their hand, you go to their turn, they still don't have cards in their hand, so you're just free to play whatever you want and Waning Moon them and just dome them for like, anywhere from 3 to like 6 arcane damage if it's blue Aether Hail that you or Aether. No, what's the 2 for 3? Ice Bolt, blue Ice Bolt that you fused with. So at that point, that's just like 10 arcane damage, and 6 of which they can't do anything about, which is very, very strong.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like there is kind of a big difference between 4 and 5 damage on a card. It's like 1 damage is like roughly a third of a card, maybe a little bit less in constructed, but it is a pretty big difference to go down that 1 damage. And I was finding that I was never really using yellows for resources. Basically
Oh yeah, I treat them the same as red. I basically like, when making sideboarding decisions, I treated them exactly as though they were red cards in my deck at that point.
Okay. Because I was going to say, the way the cost curve of the deck is really set up is basically everything costs 3 or 0. Even like Polar Blast and Cold Snap, they cost 1, and then you need 2 more to wand afterwards. And it was really, really, it's really, really hard to get 2/3 of a blue pitch of value out of a yellow pitch, in my opinion.
Yeah. Most of the time, if I was pitching it, I would use it in combination with the tuna counter to get a 3 pitch.
There you go. That does build your own blue.
Yeah.
A yellow plus a tuna counter. So that's why I was like very low on yellows in general. And I basically didn't play any all weekend. I had the 1 finals Fighting Spirit in the deck for Dromai because I wanted the 7th popper, but I never actually played Dromai, so I didn't get boarded in.
Yeah. And then I think I did try to mirror a lot of your list in my list when making these decisions. So like whereas you had Scar for a Scar, I had red Aether Hail because it blocks for 3. It's another ice card since I'm trying to ice fuse a little bit more often. And I liked having the extra ice card in order to keep Channel Lake Frigid around a little bit longer, since I was also
Mhm.
seemed to be a little bit higher on that card than you were on the weekend as well.
I played it a few times, especially in the finals.
Yeah, that's fair. And it was also just yet another card that just let me. Well, I think the vast majority of the time, I just would just keep 2 cards in my hand. The blue I wanted to Arsenal, and then this red Aether Hail when my tuna counter was up, and I would just like tuna counter Aether Hail, get some chip damage in, because nobody ABs Aether Hail in the matchups you're playing it in. Because I wouldn't play it into like, if I knew a deck was going to play like AB 2 or 3 plus like into old time, like I'm not playing red Aether Hail. But like into the aggro decks, or like the decks where you just want more efficient like chip damage in order to get the game over a little bit faster, that those were. And those are also the matchups where you want to keep Channel Lake Frigid in play longer, and you want a block 3. So that's kind of why I went with red Aether Hail, and I was happy with it. I would play red Aether Hail again.
Sure, that makes sense. I was not. I guess they block 2, so obviously I wasn't blocking very often with them. But I think like even the reds that block 3, like in Light and Strike and Aether Ice Vein, I was very hesitant to block with them because you don't have that many good red options for power cards. Like I feel like I was kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel, getting like Wounded Bull and Scar for a Scar in here, and like even playing what I think, in my opinion, is all like the pretty efficient red options. I still only have 15, and I'd almost always rather just like play one at Arsenal, another one, than not have than just block with the extra red, because then the next turn when you draw and you don't have a red, it's hard to have something proactive to do.
That's crazy that we play the deck so differently. I blocked with reds all the time. I was just like, oh, it's not a blue. It doesn't line up well. I have 2 reds in my hand at this point in time. Just get out of here, red. You're an excess red right now. Don't need you. Please leave. Happy to block. Goodbye. Even red Finals Fighting Spirit, I blocked with that card a lot because they present like a weird damage card that you get to like a 5 power damage or 4 power damage, or I especially like blocking with it into Kodachi Fi, because they attack you with the first. If you're down, they attack you with the first Kodachi. You block the second one, and then it gains you that point of life back that you didn't want to block the first Kodachi with. I don't know.
Sure.
I just block.
Yeah, that's crazy. I think that's the difference. Like the way I look at it is, when I'm playing, my biggest goal is just to like keep life totals close together, and the best way to do that is by spending your action point every turn, because like not spending your action point is like inherently kind of inefficient, because your action point's like basically worth 1 value. That's why you have to pay a premium for go again effects. So like any turn I wasn't spending my action point, I think it's going to happen sometimes, especially when you're playing a hero with no weapon that you can just activate. Like you're going to have turns where you don't use your action point, but it is a small inefficiency every time you have a turn where you don't use your action point. And because of that, that's why I kind of prioritize the red so highly.
Yeah, because it sounds like we're just playing the deck a little bit different, where you're just trying to get in more continuous damage in a shorter time frame of game overall, where I'm happy to go to like the second cycle pretty often in Iyslander, knowing like what stacks of cards are where, and knowing when I'm going to be able to disrupt my opponent at the end game. Because most decks, if you go to second cycle, they're just significantly weaker at that point in the game than they are on the first cycle. And Iyslander just getting more raw value out of her blues than other heroes do just makes her naturally better on second cycle. So between having a lower starting life total and knowing that I'd be better the longer the game goes, I was just blocking a lot. I blocked all the time.
Yeah, I think,
and really only swung the red attacks if like the math worked out that like I would take like, I think if my opponent presented like 6 plus damage on the turn, I would be more inclined to block. But like obviously on like the mopier turns, I felt like the red cards were there just like punish them heavily for like stumbling at all, or like when you had a Channel like Frigid down, or you were able to disrupt them at a key point. That's where the red cards really were shining for me, was just punishing when your opponent stumbled. I didn't play them necessarily as just like, yeah, it's 100% when I'm casting every time I draw them.
Yeah, I think that fits more in line with like the traditional Iyslander style of decks, where they have like a lot of these arcane damage spells like Ice Bolt, Aether Hail, Freezing Point, all these like cards that are like less efficient than the attacks, but they're harder to like. If you play them and your opponent's hand is awkward, it's harder for them to prevent some of the damage or block efficiently. Whereas like when I was on these attacks, that was my plan A. I was just trying to hit them every turn. I wanted to basically, if we were going to second cycle, it was because they were choosing to make us go to second cycle, not because I was ever choosing to go to second cycle. I was always just like, I'm going to play all my attacks, and if we go to second cycle, then great, my deck's still strong. But that's because you're blocking a bunch and making us go to second cycle, if that makes sense.
And you were able to consistently, obviously you were because you won the tournament, but like, it's just interesting to me that like that damage efficiency was enough to keep at parity with them in enough reasonable time frame in order to like still be able to end the game with Storm Striders at the end of the game. So my intuition would just tell me that like, I get that, 2-card 8, very efficient or whatever, good damage, but when we're thinking about like Runeblade's natural turn cycles or like Oldheim's natural turn cycles, they're still swinging and presenting way more damage than 8 damage a turn.
Oldheim very rarely is having a more efficient turn cycle than 2 blocks.
Isaac Root. Isaac Root presents more than 8 damage every turn, but yeah, I agree.
Right,
in general.
But that's if they're not blocking, and then you still block some. I was very rarely blocking so much that I couldn't spend my action point. I usually just block with 1 or 2 cards.
Well, that's why people like me don't win tournaments. We couldn't close because we didn't just attack more. I would say going forward, though, I would definitely so I said I would play Red Aether Hail again. I'd really like that card. I would not play 3 Fate Foreseen. I might play 1 just as the 4th defense reaction, but I think 6 total defense reactions were a little bit too low. And then at that point, I don't know if I would maybe Blue. I could give Blue Brother in Arms a little bit more of a chance. I didn't like it personally when I was playing it, but I could definitely see giving it more time to shine in my games. And then Freezing Point would just be a cut for me. I would just play. I don't know if I would still play Wounded Bull, but Freezing Point needs to go.
Yeah.
That card was only good on like when you're going 3rd cycle, all of your Frost Hexes are out and you're doing like 3 for 8 at minimum, or like 3 for like a bajillion once you've already given your opponent Frost Bites somehow on your turn or something like that. I don't know. Like you play Ice Eternal on your turn, and then you Arsenal the Freezing Point that was left over, and then you crack Storm Striders and Freezing Point. Like that's kind of how I was envisioning using the card, and it never came up. It was always just like a 3 for 5 that like stripped a card with Insidious Chill. If I was ever casting it, most of the time I was just like, oh, look at that Freezing Point block.
Yeah, I started with Freezing Point in the deck when I was starting to switch to the attacks, and every time I drew Freezing Point, I was blocking with it. Then I started boarding it out, and I'm like, when do I actually want this thing? This is always just a red block 3 with no text, or a 3 for 5 that sucks. And I'm like, yeah. Then I just eventually I cut it for Wounded Bull, and we started punching him.
That makes sense.
Or it might have been E-Strike. I think I might have had Wounded Bull before E-Strike.
And then I think the last card we could talk about here that's a big difference is you're not playing any Command and Conquers. You're playing all these red attacks, all of these hyper efficient cards, no Command and Conquers. Command and Conquer wasn't your 7th popper over yellow Findall's Fighting Spirit.
No, I think yellow Findall's is better into Dromai because the 1 life you gain when you pop actually matters. And I don't think the threatening to destroy their arsenal is super relevant.
I strongly disagree.
Okay. Well, and then the other reason I don't like Command and Conquer is it's 2 cards for 6, which is not particularly efficient compared to like Wounded Bull or Findall's Fighting Spirit, where there's 2 cards for 8. You get quite a bit less out of Command and Conquer. And in general, when I'm playing this deck, I'm very heavily relying on my ability to disrupt my opponent on their turn to kind of mess up their turns and weaken their turns. And I'd rather have raw value on my attacks because my opponent is already encouraged to block with hands that are easily disrupted, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if your opponent hand is bad, then they're going to be easily disrupted. But if their hand is good, then they're not going to want to block anyways.
Well, a lot of good hands is like a blue and then 3 resources of things to spend, right? Like a good 5 hand is like a blue plus Mounting Anger plus a 0 cost plus Sword plus Phoenix Flame plus Snatch at the end or Lava Burst or something, right?
Yeah,
so like,
but threatening that Arsenal card makes their hands more easily disruptible because they're either going to have to block 2 cards to keep their arsenal, but they're just going to be able to be disrupted more easily because they just can't have 5 cards.
Well, like good 2-card hands are generally like pretty hard to disrupt. Like, how do you disrupt blue plus Wounded Bull or just E-Strike, tuck a card for 7? Like,
Yeah, but that's not the way that the vast majority of decks in the format operate. I agree against those decks that are doing that stuff that normally then Command and Conquer is not at its best, but I'm talking about like the Rune Blades against, like, I think Command and Conquer is very good against Fi. The decks that like want to play the 5-card hands, Command and Conquer makes it significantly easier to disrupt and mitigate those decks like ceilings at that point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think like that's kind of why Aether Ice Vein's there, because it's like both efficient and disruptive.
Yeah, but you only have 6 of those.
Sure. I think I would probably look at yellow Aether Ice Vein over Command and Conquer if I was just looking for another action point spender that was disruptive. But I think like a couple of things that I was doing differently than more traditional Icelanders is like I'd leave my blue in Arsenal longer because I didn't want to play it, or I'd leave a red in Arsenal, which makes fusing Aether Ice Vein a pretty real cost, because then that blue that you fuse is just worth 2 damage when you pitch it for 1, because you can't always Arsenal it, if that makes sense. I think like in the end, I do think yellow Aether Ice Vein maybe should be in the list. And after the tournament, I would not claim my list was perfect. I don't know what the perfect list is. I would play it if I did. I think it's like I was happy with my deck, and I was happy with what basically we came up with the limited prep time there was for working on it. But it wouldn't surprise me if there's supposed to be some number of yellow Aether Ice Veins. I think the card is strong. And I could see CNC being a better popper than yellow Fyendals against Romai, because they're both generally 6. I think yellow Aether Ice Vein is a reasonable choice. And there are some issues with it. Like if your arsenal isn't open when you want to play it, then your Ice Fusion card just turns into 2 damage, which is reasonably below rate. But I think the card's solid. I think it's reasonable, and I think that it's possible that it should have.
Oh, I was pretty happy to do that most of the time. I know you said it's below rate, but like that means there's usually a key or a critical blue that I know is going to be maximally disruptive, like a hypothermia. Like that usually happen when like there's a hypothermia or a channel like Frigid that I didn't want to pitch on the prior turn or play on the prior turn cycle because my opponent's turn was already mopey. Or another Aether Ice. If that happens, that means there's already a card that I would consider to be a premium blue card that I know is going to steal me like either a lot of value or is going to be critically important for me in the matchup. And at that point, then I'm valuing. So I think I'm net ahead, even though I'm being slightly inefficient on that turn cycle. I think I'm going to be maximally efficient and disruptive on the next turn cycle, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. I think part of that is just your tendency to not arsenal random red attacks, whereas I'm just like, yeah, sometimes there's just a Wounded Bull sitting in my arsenal for 3 turns until I get a good chance to use it.
No, I'm like, there's an Insidious Chill in my arsenal. I just didn't have a good chance to set it up yet, so I want to set up this Insidious Chill after I get through this first Insidious Chill, and my opponent's not going to have functional hands. Once you get 2 Insidious Chills down, like stacking that card, it's so gross. And one of my favorite play patterns is that like once you have an Insidious Chill and an Amulet Device, you let the Insidious Chill trigger resolve first, and then like depending on like what's happening or the circumstance of the game, you could either choose to like keep your Amulet Device or like let them AB, or like your opponent's like, I don't want to AB this. I really like my hand. Not do anything. And you're like, oh, you really like your hand? Amulet Device you. Please give me some of that hand you like a lot. I was just kidding before. I actually meant to tax you more.
Yeah, and unless I'm going for lethal, I almost never Amulet Device before the card resolves. I always just like see what the result is, and then I'm like, oh, this seems like a good spot to Amulet Device, and then I pop it afterwards.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's different if you're like trying to Ice Eternal for lethal, but yeah, for the most part, Amulet Device flexibility that you just don't have to use it the first time you fuse a card is very nice.
Yeah, the more I played the deck, the more I'm like, I think Amulet Device is like the secret MVP of Iyslander, where it's just like, because it gives you the Insidious Chill effect, but you don't have to pay the 3 resources for it. It's just 0 cost card that you can put in your arsenal, give your opponent a Frostbite, then efficiently Waning Moon or do whatever you want with your resources at that point. Or if you are just going to attack with one of your attacks, you can just play it first and then attack with one of your attacks. It's just like, I wish I could just play like 9 of that card. It's just, even though it doesn't block, it's just everything Iyslander wants to be doing anyways.
I don't know if I'd go to 9 copies, but I would definitely play the 4th copy if I could. And then one other thing that's really nice about it, like, so it's a 0 cost from Arsenal. You can give them a Frostbite. If you don't want a Waning Moon, you can still just give them the Frostbite, and you don't have to worry about like wasting resources because you can just play it.
Right.
And then other times it also, since it costs 0, it works really nicely with Blue Brother and Arms too, which you can play it, then use Blue Brother and Arms and also swing Waning Moon. So I think Amulet of Ice is one of the best cards in the deck.
Yeah.
One of the best, or probably the best Ice Blue, honestly.
I would agree with you at this point. Okay. And then I guess the very, very last thing we can talk about is like the cards that didn't make either of our lists, like Blue Arctic Incarceration, where a lot of people love that card. So many people are like, you don't have Blue Arctic Incarceration? I'm like, yeah, I don't know. It just it never did much for me. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the biggest argument for Blue Arctic Incarceration is its interaction with how strong it is when you have 3 Frost Hexes in play. It turns into a 1-card 6, basically.
I
when you have
never had 3 Frost Hexes in play over the course of the entire weekend. Even when I was like going for maximum combo, like 2 was enough to close out a game. 3 just seems completely superfluous to me. And I don't know how you're having the time to both set up these like Insidious Chills and Frost Hexes all the time in the game, because they're even though you can play them on your opponent's turn or whatever, they're still clunky, you know?
I agree 100% that I never have 3 Frost Hexes in play. And I think the entire weekend I had 2 Frost Hexes in play in the Iyslander mirror and maybe against one Oldheim opponent. But almost never do I have that many Frost Hexes in play. And also when you get to that point, cards like Cold Snap and Polar Blast do something very similar, where you can play a Cold Snap or a Polar Blast from Arsenal and give your opponent 1 Frostbite and have 2 resources floating. The blue that you pitch to play it replaces itself, and then you can use those 2 resources left to Waning Moon them for 3. So you're still getting 1 Frostbite plus 3 damage, which when you have 3 Frost Hexes is 6 damage, the same way that Arctic Incarceration gets you 6 damage. So I think like these cards are much better when you don't have all the Frost Hexes in play, and then when you do have the Frost Hexes in play, they're almost just as good. And
you're so much more incentivized to play the Insidious Chill than you are the Frost Hexes when you draw them in the same hand, because Frost Hex blocks for 3. So you want, like, I'm just like, oh, this card blocks for 3. This one's the one that's getting blocked with. Then I'm going to play the Insidious Chill.
yeah, that's definitely true. And I think Insidious Chill almost always gets you more value, even if you just like you're going first, it's turn 0 and you have both in your hand. I almost always would pick the Insidious Chill because that one's like almost always going to get 2.5 to 3 cards of value.
And setting up the first Frost Hex is like a pain. Like the first Frost Hex has like such a minimal impact to the game, it feels like. The second one starts feeling good, and then obviously if you somehow get the third one, it's just that's when like the card shines. But like the fact that like the first one is so unimpactful most of the time that like it almost discourages you from even playing the first one in a lot of turn cycles.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. The first one usually doesn't get that much damage because when you have the 1 Frost Hex in play, it's not worth it to like try to time your Frostbites to get the 1 damage out of them. But when you get 2 and 3, like suddenly it's like when you have 3 Frost Hexes in play, it's suddenly super efficient to cast these Ice Eternals and stuff to give them a bunch of Frostbites. But when you have 1, Ice Eternal's still not a particularly efficient card.
Okay. Anything else about Iyslander you want to talk about before we wrap things up here, Michael?
I love how big of a meme Wounded Bull became.
Yeah, you destroyed Talishar. Good job.
Yeah, I've heard trying to play on Talishar today. It's just all Wounded Bull Icelanders. But yeah, that's all. Any closing thoughts from you?
Oh, you asked me the question. You did it. I was about to say, I don't have any closing thoughts on Iyslander either, but thank you, Michael. But you did it. That will pivot now into the final closing thing, which is so many people came up to us over the weekend and said they liked the podcast, and that was amazing. Like, that was really cool. Thank you very much to everybody. Like, at the start of the weekend, like, we got like a couple compliments on Friday before the tournament started. I was like, oh, that'll probably be all we get. And so I took down like the names of like Kyle and let's see, I have them around here. I send you a lot of messages on Discord, Michael.
Yeah, we talk a lot. That's crazy.
Oh, no.
It's like we like each other or something.
Now I'm asking you for Skull Crushers. I went too far. Hold on. Oh. Sebastian, Kyle, and Fino were the first 3. So they're
and Tom.
And Tom. Yeah, Tom. Yeah, we met Tom. Was the first one. And past that, it just got a little overwhelming, to be honest, but in a good way, in a completely good way that I am incredibly appreciative for and really is super motivating to keep making the podcast.
Yeah. Last week you were all down. People didn't talk to you and stuff. And then this weekend everyone delivered. It was great. And then you crushed the calling too. It's a good
Yeah.
weekend.
I guess I didn't talk about that, but maybe next week we'll talk about mental health a little bit more, because that was the most commented thing on the last week's cast, was that, like, Roger, I really, identify with what you're talking about not feeling good enough or whatever. And I think it's something that we should talk about at some point on the cast, is like mental health and managing all that stuff, especially now that even despite my, you know, good performance in a tournament, I feel good about my ability to play Flesh and Blood. I'm just completely fucking burned out on this game at the moment, just speaking honestly, and I'm not going to Worlds. Like, I am so unmotivated to like prepare for another like high level major tournament at this point in time in my life, just between everything else that I have going on, that I'm ready for the wintertime fat break already. So spoiler, I will not be at Worlds.
So sad.
There are more important things in life than Flesh and Blood sometimes.
I won't argue with that. All right. Ready to close this out?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for listening, everybody. We really appreciate it. And next time you're playing Flesh and Blood, always remember, mind your manners. Thanks for listening.